Thank you. I am not nervous at all, but I am over-caffeinated, so be prepared. Just to preface this, these are all the places you can find me online. You can also constantly find me hitting refresh on Kickstarter right now. And if you have any questions or anything, I'm always available through these various channels. All right, so let's talk about these 3 books first. What do these books have in common? Well, they're all fiction. They're also 3 of the 4 best-selling books in the US market last year. The best-selling book is actually this book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And this book is actually nonfiction, but it's told from a very story-based approach. While it is all about tidying up, people are actually enjoying reading about cleaning their houses because Marie Kondo uses elements of storytelling throughout. And humans like stories. Humans like reading fiction. We relate to it in a way that we just don't relate quite the same way to nonfiction. I don't have hard numbers on the preference for reading fiction over reading documentation, but I'm pretty confident that even in this room, even at a documentation conference, there aren't a lot of us who read documentation purely for fun. So how can we bring the appeal of fiction to documentation? How can we use the tools of fiction writing to improve our documentation? So let's start with the process of writing fiction. So these are 10 rules from Elrond Leonard, and they're all about the process. And I want to say that no matter what you're writing, whether you're writing documentation, whether you're writing fiction, whether you're writing marketing content or anything else, your process is probably a bit personal. You have some style quirks that probably translate across everything you write. Personally, my style is full of all the em dashes. I overuse em dashes very frequently, and you can always tell something I've written as a result. And since writing is so personal, I'm not about to tell any other writer that they're doing something wrong. Elrond Leonard felt very comfortable offering up these 10 rules, and they are good rules. And most of them translate well into rules for documentation. Now, Elrond Leonard is somebody who, when we're talking about writing fiction, I do think we should listen to. You may not have read any of his books, but you've probably at least heard of some of the movies and shows that have been made off of his books. This is Justified, which is in its 5th season now. The movie Get Shorty, Jackie Brown, 3:10 to Yuma, all of these are based off of Elrond Leonard's novels or short stories. He is incredibly prolific, and his stories have translated well to multiple types of media. So I think that I'm comfortable at least listening to Elrond Leonard's suggestions. Whether you should listen to me may be a slightly different matter. I haven't, had a major motion picture made out of any of my writing, but I have gone ahead and translated Leonard's rules for documentarians. So this particular set of rules, I think, is really relevant to what we're doing. So a lot of good fiction has certain elements. And these, I think, bring us straight down to those elements. How do we keep our writing from getting in the way of what our readers need to do? How do we get out of the way of the story and communicate that information? Now, I'm not going to read off all of these because I really just don't approve of reading slides on general principle. But I will make this slide deck available later on if you need to copy it down. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty that these rules address. Let's talk about emotion first. So as documentation writers, the past few years, we've been getting much better about audience and emotion. We've been getting better about understanding reader personas, analyzing our audience, getting to know what they need to do in order to use our documentation successfully. But I really want to drive home how important the idea of audience is, and how important it is in documentation and storytelling. So this is a quote from John Steinbeck. He has written a lot of fancy books that are in literature classes everywhere. I'm not the biggest fan of his writing, but he has some good things to say about the process of writing. And I really like this quote because I do believe that as we're writing, we need to think about a single reader. Our audience, ultimately, is one person. And if we have that one individual audience member in our heads, writing out a narrative of our documentation geared just to that person can be incredibly helpful. And hopefully you're already doing a little bit of that in your work. For example, as you're working on a piece of documentation, you're probably thinking about what a Windows user versus a Linux user needs. You might be thinking across browsers, you might think about accessibility. But we can go a little bit deeper than that. We can think about how documentation changes between our different readers. So these are two books by an author by the name of John Scalzi. He does science fiction, and in these two books, he did this beautiful job of telling a story from two very different points of view for two very different audiences. So Zoe's Tale is a story set from the perspective of a 17-year-old girl. It is written for young adult audiences. The Last Colony is the third novel in a space opera series. However, both books tell the same story. The Last Colony is from the perspective of an adult man. It's part of a standing series that readers probably have gone through before they get to this book. Zoe's Tale is standalone, but it's the same story. And a reader reading both of these books gets more information than just reading one. If you read both books, you're not bored because even though the story is the same, the perspective, the information that's important, the parts of the story that are emphasized differ. So this actually grows out of a really standard fiction writing exercise. Rewriting a story from a different perspective or for a different audience is something that you see in fiction writing workshops all of the time. And it's really a useful approach because if you've got a mental block on what has to happen in a story or what you need to make sure that your audience knows before moving on to the next point, rewriting a scene or two, or sometimes even the whole story, can let you find different approaches to that story. And in documentation, we can draw from this exercise. We can create different versions of documentation for different audiences, at least on a basic outline level. Even a draft or just notes can give us a better understanding of what we really have to get across. Of course, as you're publishing your documentation, you only want to present one point of view to your reader. You don't want to be switching up things with stylistic decisions that confuse a reader. But that doesn't mean that you should only write from one point of view. So this is very standard writing advice for fiction writers. Everybody says, you should write what you know. In theory, Mark Twain may have originated this phrase. Nobody's really sure, though, but it's been around as advice for over 150 years at this point. But there's actually a variation on this that I think is better advice from Virginia Woolf. No matter what you write, your experience is going to color the final draft. Whether or not you're writing about something that you really know very well, or if you're writing about something that you've just researched, your experience is going to show through. And in fiction writing, this can be a very good thing. A good novel is always going to share a perspective that a reader might not get otherwise. In documentation, personal experience is much more of a mixed blessing. If you aren't paying attention, it can be very easy to assume that readers have a similar background to your own, that they'll understand exactly what you mean when you say something. And I think we all do a good job of watching out for big assumptions, like whether a web app will perform exactly the same in Internet Explorer as anywhere else, but life experience can still trip us up. Assuming that just because a person knows how to write a Python program, that they also know how to use the command line seems like a logical assumption, but it isn't. There are plenty of Python courses that do not rely on the command line at all. So you're never going to know every single thing about your audience and even your product. Even if you're documenting code that you wrote yourself, you're going to learn things about your own code from the way that other people use the software or use your code in the future. But you can know yourself, at least pretty well. You can have a clear idea of your own experiences and of the opinions that you hold and the biases that inform your thinking. And you can pay close attention to how those experiences and those opinions come out in your writing. You don't have to remove experience or opinion or any of that from your writing, because good writing and good documentation writing gets a little personal. It gets a little human. But you should make an active decision about what stays in your documentation and what you edit out. So as a way to sort of look for these different opinions and experiences, there are a few keywords that I use when I am editing so that I pull out all the things that I think, but that may not be actually true. So opinion words are generally a very good indicator that something is an opinion. Transitions and introduction words are also good indicators of opinions and experience. When you see words like this, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just a personal thought, but it's something that you should keep an eye out for. As I'm writing a piece, I will search for these words, especially in the final round of editing, so that I can identify where I've focused on what I know and where I've focused on what the reader actually needs to learn. So once again, I'm not going to read off all this stuff, but slide deck available later. All right. Let's cover this section as briefly as possible. Charles Dickens was paid by the word for the novels he wrote. That is the only thing that justifies how long most of his books are. In comparison, Ernest Hemingway is delightfully brief. This is a whole story in just 6 words. And good writing is clean and clear and at least a little concise. Ernest Hemingway provides a good model for writing concisely and clearly. He does not provide a good role model for anything else. And that's all I really have to say about being brief. Though I would recommend checking out the Hemingway Editor app, which gives you feedback on how to make your prose sound more like Hemingway's. So, emotion. Emotion matters. Even in documentation, emotion is crucial. Instruction manuals are already known for their emotional impact. Anger at hard-to-follow instructions is a very well-established trope in our industry. Hopefully, anger is not the emotion that you're looking to create in your readers, however. So let's take a look at how fiction writers use emotion. Fiction writers really want you to feel extreme emotions, like happiness or sadness, whenever you're reading their work. They want to write a tearjerker or something that makes you laugh out loud. As documentation writers, we have some different options. Of course, documentation can be funny if you add some humor, and we've already covered that documentation can be absolutely maddening, but we've got a few other options as well. We can shoot for the feelings of inspiration and satisfaction far beyond what fiction writers have access to. So fictional plots all use a combination of rising and falling action to drive emotion. These two options are basically the two dials that any author can use to control the plot. And while I pick on Charles Dickens, I have to say that A Christmas Carol has a really clear example of rising and falling action. English teachers, literature teachers, love teaching the Christmas Carol story because it's really easy to teach. There's no weird bumpy bits. So if we take a look at this plot graph of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, it's pretty basic. We've got, at the first point, Scrooge is starting off the story. He's clearly kind of a jerk. And we're motivated to see what happens to him because we're not really so sure that we like him. The action starts to rise. We get the 3 ghosts coming through. And at the climax, Scrooge has his grand epiphany that, maybe he should be a nice guy. And then, as the action levels off, we're reassured that he actually has transformed. We are shown that the change in his nature is long-term. In comparison, a lot of documentation has a plot graph like a cliffhanger. We're all talking about rising action, and then we just drop with no conclusion that ties it all together. And this is a huge problem that I've noticed in my own writing. I'll write a tutorial, I lay out all the steps, I get the reader to the point where they can follow the instructions and get to the end result that they're hoping for, and I just walk away. No one needs anything more, right? Well, a little bit of a conclusion can actually be really useful. A little bit of falling action can bring us to a better closing point in our documentation. After all, I want my readers to be inspired to make the most of the information that I'm providing to them. I want them to know to take it the next step or how to use this particular tutorial. So that means not just building smooth steps to increase the rising action, but also letting people down a little bit more smoothly. In my own conclusions, I've been trying to build a list of good falling action for documentation. I use the idea of adding in, the next step after a given tutorial or a piece of information. What do you do after you've completed the tutorial? There's also adding context so you know where to apply the tool in question more widely, or suggestions for taking a project to the next level. And these suggestions are clearly not exhaustive, but I just want to give you a few ideas to start thinking about conclusions in your own work. All right, so Kill Your Darlings is another really standard piece of advice for fiction writers. We're writers. We really love playing with words and showing off how good we are at putting sentences together, and we're very clever, and we want all of our readers to know how clever we are. Our readers don't actually like the cleverness, it turns out. So the idea in fiction writing is that all those bits of cleverness, those are the first things that you should edit out. Anything that you are really attached to and you don't even touch as you're working through your manuscript editing, that's the stuff that actually needs to leave. We can't really afford to leave the clever bits in. The only people who appreciate overly clever writing are other writers. So share it with us, don't share it with your reader. Yank out anything that is too clever. So we want clear writing. Clear writing is far more important than clever writing. Chop out every piece that you can find. I actually have a page on my wall where I post things that I think are particularly clever, but that I can't actually send out into the world because it's too confusing. It's more for me than for them. And if you really enjoy crafting those darling phrases, my journalism professor in college told me that's what poetry is for. All right, so context. Even if you are completely caught up with a long-running fiction series, say Game of Thrones, you need some context just to be sure of what's going on. And I like to pick on Game of Thrones because it is immense. It is long. It is told from dozens of different perspectives. There's so many layers of detail. And George R. R. Martin has this style of skipping around between different perspectives and sometimes different times, and going eons without checking in with a particular character, which lets you think that they're dead, but maybe they're dead, but maybe they're not dead. George R. R. Martin is a special man, and he makes his work surprisingly difficult to follow for such a popular series. And I don't know about all of you, but I just kind of assume that all the characters are dead at this point until told specifically otherwise. And with this level of complexity, HBO has had to build piles of documentation about the series to make sure that watchers can easily keep up with everything. And furthermore, that's on top of what fans wrote and published back when Game of Thrones was only available in dead tree format. At the most basic level, we're talking about the map that we see when the show starts. It's beautiful, it's creative, it's got all these moving pieces. But it's also context for the audience so we can remember what's happening and where different scenes take place. If you are a dedicated watcher of the show, you know that the map at the beginning is not the same from episode to episode. It only shows the places where there's going to be scenes in the upcoming show. In less ambitious fiction, writers can get away with less context. A lot of novels include just a glossary. Fantasy and science fiction novels with made-up languages are particularly in need of this context, but it also works across other types of fiction. Maps, character guides, footnotes, these are all options that support good fiction. Show, don't tell is a standard mantra in fiction writing. But the reality is that any sort of writing needs some sort of context and some sort of support to make sure that readers get every bit of nuance. This is absolutely true of documentation, especially considering that search engines can plop a reader down right in the middle of a wiki or a guide or somewhere else in your documentation where they don't automatically have context. We do have an advantage over fiction writers, though. A novelist is only going to be able to convince a reader to flip to the glossary at the end of the book so many times. And if somebody is reading on an ebook reader, they will often just ignore the glossary entirely because most ebook readers don't do a particularly good job of transferring us from the story to an appendix or anything else. However, if we're dealing with online documentation, we can add hyperlinks everywhere, and we can let readers decide when to click and what context helps their experience. We do have to balance the need for being brief, but once again, when we can link to different pieces, we don't have to worry too much about cramming everything into one specific paragraph. So, reading orders. What order do you tell your audience to read your documentation in? Is your reading order based on publication order, chronological order, a specific process they have to follow? You can't always get readers to follow every direction. I don't think they're called readers anymore. If they do exactly what you say, that might be a little bit different. But you can always make recommendations. So personally, I prefer to read fiction based on when it was published. The first book published first is the good starting point. Following a writer as they make their way through their story makes more sense than a lot of other options. I recently read Robin McKinley's two-part series, The Blue Sword and The Hero and the Crown, and I made the mistake of reading The Hero and the Crown first. The Hero and the Crown is set several hundred years before The Blue Sword. But McKinley actually wrote The Hero and the Crown years after publishing The Blue Sword. And there are references in The Hero and the Crown that are much harder to spot if you haven't read The Blue Sword first. McKinley has even written articles that make it clear that you should always read The Blue Sword first. People get in huge arguments with her on the internet because the internet is made for arguments. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. When people argue with you about the proper reading order of any materials, as soon as you actually have an order to argue about, they can make their own reading lists, they can make their own recommendations, and they'll often do so for use cases that you haven't even addressed yet, so that you'll reach a whole new audience. So, as we're talking about reading order, we need to talk about the idea of canon as well. Canon is crucial when talking about fiction. It's the idea of the core information that has to remain true over the course of multiple storylines. For us, the material that we consider canon is the core documentation. It's the stuff that should be treated as truth. It's the stuff that's based on what's actually going on with the product and service, not the observed behavior that leads to weird hacks on Stack Overflow or tutorials on personal blogs. So you need to maintain a list of your canon, the material that you want people to categorically trust over all other resources. And when I say the word maintain, I also mean that this is the stuff that you have to maintain with more dedication. This is your core set of documentation, the capital T truth of your world. It needs care and attention on a regular basis. And just as a popular novel can get reissued, you can always reissue documentation and update it. Long-lived series like Nancy Drew do exhaustive upgrades on a regular basis. New versions of old Nancy Drew books come out regularly, updating the technology, the language, other details to make the books seem more modern. They also, luckily, remove all of the racist comments from the first edition. Sometimes the publisher might even bring the story to new media, like video games. And we can use these approaches to keep refreshing our documentation, even between official releases. So the concept of canon is particularly important if we start talking about fan fiction. For those of you who are unfamiliar with fan fiction, it's stories about the characters in a well-known piece of media, but written by fans. Fans can write anything they want, but it's all centered around a core universal truth, a core story. So depending on what you're writing docs for, you probably hope that people will use whatever you've written and then build on top of it. Maybe you want somebody to write a plugin, maybe you want somebody to write a tutorial, but you want active community. And no matter how your community builds on your documentation, hopefully they're building something valuable. So how can we make the process easier for them? Creating that core set of canon docs is a good start, but you can also support fan fiction projects by having style guides, templates, offering even feedback. So while many fiction authors will just announce on their site that they welcome people to write fan fiction as long as not commercialized and sold, they probably won't read it because of legal reasons. But some authors really actively encourage their fan communities. Meg Cabot, who wrote The Princess Diaries, has a forum on her website where people can post fan fiction about her books and get feedback. Also a concept from fan fiction, the concept of beta readers means that you can encourage communities a little bit more in another way. Fan fiction writers go through a surprisingly standard editorial process, even though no editors per se are usually involved. Rather, fan fiction writers rely heavily on beta readers who will go through their work and make recommendations. A dozen people or more may read a piece of fan fiction in various beta versions before the author declares that the work is done. Sometimes this process is even done in full view of the community, letting everyone weigh in on the process of editing a new story. The same sort of sentiment drives a lot of writers' workshops. And that sort of collaborative editing process is incredibly valuable, and I'd love to see more of it when writing documentation. We talk about releasing software in beta versions all the time. So why can't we create more beta or pre-release versions of our documentation for more feedback? We're starting to see some examples from publishing companies like O'Reilly, but we can workshop our documentation without having the full force of a publishing company behind us. Lastly, and most importantly, we have to talk about reading. I don't know any good fiction writers who don't read. Actually, I don't know any good writers who don't read. The more widely you read, the better. An article here or a novel there can spark ideas. And I'm not just talking about ideas for good fiction. You get new metaphors, new perspectives with every word you read. So schedule time every day to both read and write, and do both with as much variety as you can. Read op-eds, write sonnets, write op-eds, read sonnets, and take Bradbury's suggestion to read intensely to heart. Take notes and save copies of writing that you really like. So I want to just leave you with 4 books that I have found that have really immensely impacted my writing. And I think I am completely out of time, so I won't discuss them in any depth, but please come talk to me afterwards. Thank you all.